Okay, thank you, Arthur, and good morning, everyone. And let's start unwrapping this orange. Okay, this is what we're going to run through. What's segmentation? How do you undertake one? We're not going to run through the technical aspects of it. I'm sure you'll be glad to know that. What I really want to achieve with this, and I hope that will chime in with what people are looking for, is to enable people to understand the key things you need to think about if you're involved in a segmentation, give you some tricks of the trade, but not turn you into analysts. Cluster analysis, which is a technique that's normally used, is quite a complex thing, and if you're involved in a segmentation and you don't have the skills yourself for the technical aspects, you should talk to someone and use someone who can help you with that. The format of the presentation is to run through a number of the issues, the areas. That will take about 15 minutes, and then the second half of the presentation, I've got a couple of case histories which will hopefully illustrate some of the points that I'm talking about. Okay, according to Wikipedia, which is the fount of all knowledge, it seems to me these days, this is their definition of market segmentation. And the key thing is it involves dividing a broad target market into subsets who have some sort of common needs. Now this could be dividing a market so that there are different products for different segments. This is a very simple example of perhaps a mobile phone operator or manufacturer who makes 3 phones, one with large keys targeted at older people like me who have trouble hitting the right keys. Perhaps also have a smartphone targeted at younger people, and also have a third phone which has a good camera and it's targeted at those taking lots of photos. So these are 3 products, and the products can be aimed at 3 different segments. You can also have a situation where there's just one product and the segments and the purpose of segmentation is to help you understand the fact that different people will have different needs from the same product, and you can then target your communications to the particular needs of those different segments. So some people might be interested in price, so you tell them about how competitively this particular phone's priced. Some might use their phone a lot for listening to music, so you communicate to them how good the music quality is on this phone, and some may use the phone a lot for taking videos and photos, and so you communicate how good the phone is at those particular aspects. So it's one product, but by deriving segments with different requirements, you're targeting your communications in a different way for the different segments. So the key thing of segmentation really is to enable you to understand what different segments need from your product or service, so that you can either devise products or services, or I've said communications, to align with those particular needs. What this means is when you derive segments, they need to be reasonably homogeneous. So the people in a segment need to be fairly similar to one another, but they need to be different from people in other segments so that your targeting works well. And this needs to be done on what I've said there, a range of relevant measures, and we'll come to what the measures are a bit later on. As I mentioned earlier, cluster analysis is normally used to create segments. We're not going to talk about this too much, but I've just got a couple of charts which sort of show you basically how it works. And you basically put people in the same cluster if they're similar on the measures you decide to use. There's lots of different methods that you can use, and your analyst could advise you on the advantages and disadvantages of each. The measures you use are quite critical. Depending on which measures you use to derive your clusters, you may get different solutions. And so these are the sort of key areas I'd normally look at if I was thinking of doing a segmentation. So one will be an initial phase of qualitative research, where you talk to people in the particular market and try and understand what motivates them, what are the key things that they think about when they're buying products in this particular area. So that you sort of understand their different motivations. Your client may have a lot of data about the market. There may be lots of internal metrics that you could use. There may be previous research that you can rely on, either that the client's done or that you've done yourself in this market, which gives you an idea of the sort of measures to use. There may be previous segmentations, again in this market, or that you've done yourselves. And you shouldn't underestimate the value of gut feel. A lot of marketeers, if they've been involved in a product area for a long while, have a pretty good understanding of what makes it tick. So you essentially look at all those things and come up with a range of measures or attributes that you think are important in describing this particular marketplace. I've got a very simple little example here where there are two measures and we've got a dozen respondents. They're plotted on this two-dimensional graph, and the respondents A and B are fairly similar on these two measures, and so you might put them in the same cluster. You might do this over and over again. Again, this is a very simple example with 10 respondents, and this is called a dendrogram, if you want to know the technical term, and it shows how respondents get merged together into clusters as you gradually move through the process. So initially respondents 1 and 3 are put together into a cluster, then 4 and 9, then 6 and 8, then 5 and 10, then respondent 7 is put in with a cluster that's been formed of 6 and 8, and so on, until you've got everyone in one happy but not very homogeneous cluster. And then part of the analyst skill is deciding where to cut, how many clusters should we have for this solution. When you're thinking of the measures to use, you could just use demographics, but given you're putting people together who are similar on whatever measures you use, if you just use, for example, age and gender to create clusters, you will almost certainly get a cluster of younger men, younger women, older men and older women, not particularly insightful. So demographics alone will produce fairly obvious clusters. You could use behaviour, you could use attitudes. In my experience, attitudes can be very powerful in developing clusters, because if you get attitudinal clusters, you've put together people who think the same way about a particular market. And if those attitudinal clusters then exhibit different behaviours, then this is often the best option. So my normal approach would be to start with attitudes. If that works in generating segments have very different behaviours and different demographics, then you're there. If not, you may need to put some behavioural or even demographic measures into the cluster analysis itself. When the cluster analysis has been done, it may generate several possible segmentations, and this is one of the unusual aspects of cluster analysis. Often when you use an analytical technique, two analysts will come to the same solution. This is not usually the case with cluster analysis, and so you need to look at the solutions that have been offered. But there are a number of criteria to use to decide what's the best solution, and so you're getting very hard quantitative data, but you're applying some qualitative judgments. So you need a decent number of segments. If you have more than 10, you can't really visualize them. If you have less than 4, then it's not really a segmentation. Each segment needs to be a decent size. You don't want one segment to be 90% of the market, because it's not really then a segmentation. And you don't want a segment with only 1 or 2 people in it. So you need each segment to be of a reasonable size. The segment should be unique on some key measures. If 2 segments look very similar, then you should probably put them together. There is a statistical measure that the analyst will normally produce, which is the variance within a segment. I said at the beginning that segments need to be quite homogeneous, and this measure tells you how homogeneous the segment is. If this is too high, then the segment's probably not homogeneous. And you really need to be able to visualize each segment. So by applying these criteria, and it's often a good idea to involve the client in this part of the project. The client's going to be the person who has to run with the segments that are produced. So the best segments that I've worked on have been done in this sort of partnership. You might present several different solutions, talk through them, and then together come to a solution where you've turned the clusters, which are the technical solution, into the segments, which are the more creative solution. One of the outputs that's really useful from a segmentation is what's called magic questions or golden questions. There's lots of names for them. But these are a subset of the measures that you've used that enable you to assign someone to a segment with a high degree of accuracy. We normally look for sort of 70% correct assignment. Another technique is used to create these, but they can be applied at two levels. You can apply them, ask people to answer the magic questions to determine which segment they should be in. You might want to do that if you're going to map segments onto a database, or if you're going to assign segments to some future research that's been done so that you can cross-tab the research by the segments. They can also be used in a slightly different way and in a simpler way to enable group recruitment. So let's say you recruit, you generate a segment of working mums, for example. That's what it's called. You have magic questions. What you want to do in recruiting a group of working mums is to identify those very accurately. But if they're not working mums, you're not bothered what segment they're actually in. And so this is a simpler set of magic questions than for the first case, because all you want to do is see, is someone in my target segment or not? Quite often you can reduce this to 3 or 4 questions, which can fairly easily be included in a recruitment screener to recruit people who belong to a particular segment. This is what a magic question algorithm might look like, and this is just an Excel sheet. This is actually an eBay segmentation that I'm going to show you in a moment. There are 17 magic questions, all on 1 to 10 scales. They're disagree, agree scales. The person puts in their response, and the algorithm in the Excel spreadsheet determines which segment they're in. It basically works out a probability that someone's in each segment and then assigns them to the segment with the highest probability. You can also set this up in HTML, so you can put something like this on a web page, and you know, I've seen a number of examples where clients have done that, so that when, for example, people register on a site, they can be asked these questions on the site and then assigned immediately to a segment. Okay, a few other issues about segments. Segment names, these can be quite emotive sometimes, and there are several things to bear in mind when you're thinking about what to call the segments. If you call the segment something that relates to any demographics, again in this eBay segmentation there's a segment called Shopaholics that we originally called High Street Honeys, not a very PC type name, but fairly obvious from that name that there are a lot of females in the segment. The danger of using a name like that is there's then a presumption that everyone in that segment is a female. So if you use demographics in the names or in any of the pictures to describe the segment, there's a danger that people will think everyone in that segment has those particular characteristics. So that's something to bear in mind. Second thing to bear in mind is the durability of a segment name. If you want a segmentation to last for a while, you don't want to use a name that's very popular at the moment, might be a buzzword at the moment, but in a year's time no one will know what it means. Some of you may be old enough to remember yuppies in the 1980s. That was a term that was very popular at the time, but it didn't last very long. The other thing I would say with segment names is they need to resonate with the ethos of your client. You know, it's no good using funky names for a client that's not really a funky client. So just think about that when you're setting the names. The names are quite important. Second thing that I've sort of found in my experience is that it's important to have a segment champion in the client organisation. There was some research done a couple of years ago that suggested that about 75% of the research budget spent on segmentation was wasted. And most of that was not because the segmentations were technically unsound. Most of them were technically quite sound. It was just they'd not been implemented very well within the organisation. So in an ideal world, you need a champion who's going to run with the segmentation and take it on. And allied to that, you need to, again, be able to present the segments, introduce the segments, launch them in an effective way, and in the the two examples that I'll show you in a moment, we have ways of doing that. So a segment champion is quite important if you can find one. The third thing that's quite important is mapping segments onto a customer database. If a client wants to do this, then it's really important to understand this at the outset. And if it's an absolutely critical part of the segmentation brief, then you might only use measures that are on the customer database to create the segments. You might not. There are ways of getting around that. If you create attitudinal segments, you can still map them onto customer databases using what's called a bridge survey, and again I'll talk a bit about that later on. But it's really important to understand up front whether a client does want to do this. I have one classic example where a client said to me, no, we don't want to do that. We want the best segments. We just want to understand our market. And then right at the end they said, okay, how do we map these onto our customer database? So important to get that understood up front. So that's enough of the background. I just want to run through a couple of examples. This first one's for eBay. It's quite an old segmentation. It's not actually in the public domain, but the client was happy for me to talk about it as long as it was only used in a training sense. So when the charts on this become available, do treat them with that respect, that they're just meant to be used to show you how this segmentation works, and not used in any proposals or anything like that. Okay, so what did eBay want to do? This was done in 2003, and eBay was quite new in the UK. It had 6 million registered users, but a new marketing director was appointed, and his objective was to increase that to 15 million over a 3-year period. So that was quite a stiff objective. So that was the business objective, and the segmentation objective was to derive distinct segments that would allow segment-specific marketing messages to be developed for particular segments. So it was the same product, eBay is the same universally, but the idea was to understand different parts of the market so that particular messages could be created that resonated with particular segments. Okay, so we used attitudinal data for this. We had a large number of attitudinal statements on 1 to 10 scales. Attitudes to the internet, attitudes to shopping online, and attitudes to bidding for things online. And we derived 7 segments. Here they are. And now you'll see here all these segments had a decent number in, meeting one of my criteria, between 1.5 million and sort of a bit over 3 million people in each one. So they're all of a decent size. The segment names are all single words. This was a client mandate that they only wanted single words. They didn't want anything in the segment name that described anything other than the particular segment's approach to online shopping, online working, and so on. So they range from passionates, opportunists, apprehensives, and so on. So all derived attitudinally. But when we looked at their behaviour, very different in terms of the amount of money they spent online, all in dollars, I'm afraid, because given eBay started off in the US. So 4 segments spending around about $2,000 a year online, possibly a bit more interesting than the other 3 segments that were spending about $1,000 a year online. Passionates the top, pragmatists the second in terms of spending online. But in terms of using eBay, the passionates were using eBay a lot, but the pragmatists were not using them very much. Only a quarter of pragmatists were registered eBay users. So the pragmatists appeared to be a very potentially rewarding segment to look at. They spent a lot of money online, but they didn't do much of it with eBay. So we developed some pen pictures about each of the clusters, and here's a few facts and figures about pragmatists. So these are some of the attitudinal statements. They strongly agreed, so this is an index number, so if it's bigger than 100 they're more likely to say this. So internet shopping makes life easier. It's not worth selling things online. Shopping online saves time. So they're very much into the pragmatic things, hence their name, about shopping online. They do it because it's convenient, it's easier, it's quicker. They don't do it for fun. Whereas the passionates, I haven't got the charts here for passionates, you know, doing all this for fun. So pragmatists were not into things like boot sales, collectors. They didn't enjoy shopping for sales, for clothes. They didn't like the sales. They didn't like to shop. It's a necessary evil for them. Pretty tech savvy, pragmatic, again, hence the name. You'd expect pragmatists to be pragmatic, not particularly thrill seekers or addictive. So quite sensible people, not particularly impulsive. And the one thing about them in terms of their knowledge of eBay at that time was they thought eBay was an auction site for second-hand goods. They didn't realise you could buy new stuff on eBay, you could buy it now, you didn't have to bid, and that you could buy from recognised retailers. And so the way forward for eBay was they spend lots of money on high-ticket items. They'll use eBay if they perceive it's practical. They won't use it for fun. So they need to be assured they can buy now, buy new from a respected list of retailers. So eBay developed a TV campaign with one execution aimed at this group, another campaign aimed at the apprehensive group. So they used a mass medium, but the executions were designed to appeal to the motivations, the barriers to use of these particular groups. And in the 6 months after the campaign ran, the percent of their new registered users from these two segments doubled. And so very clearly, the campaign had worked in the sense of targeting these people and making them come to eBay. In terms of the launch, this was quite interesting. One of those apocryphal launches, if you like. There were about 250 eBay staff in the UK at the time, and we gave them all the magic questions to complete and assign them to segments. And then they all came along to a debrief session where they had a chair with their name on it and a coloured T-shirt. It was just a coloured T-shirt. It didn't say anything about the segment, but it did represent the segment they were in. But when they arrived, it immediately started them talking, why have I got a red T-shirt, you've got a blue one? They didn't know what the difference was at that particular time. Then in the debrief, we spent about, not long, 5 minutes or so on each segment, colour-coded. We showed them the key data about their segment. So immediately, I've got a blue T-shirt, I'm looking at the blue segment. Oh yeah, I'm starting to identify with that segment. Then at the end of the debrief, the members of each segment went off into groups with a moderator. Some of the really big segments were divided into 2 or 3 groups, and the idea was, you are all passionates or you are all pragmatists. We've told you a bit about who you are. You all work for this company. We want you to develop some ideas that eBay can incorporate to encourage you as passionates or pragmatists to use eBay more. So immediately, the members of staff were engaged with the segmentation, and for the company, they were starting to get a few ideas as to things they could do to develop interest amongst each particular segment. We then all went off to a bar where the barman had created 7 cocktails, 1 for each segment and colour-coded, and one of my colleagues who's in this photo that's coming up on the right there, Max, you can see him with a glass. With one of the cocktails in, he decided that he needed to try all the 7 cocktails so they could experience all the 7 segments. So that was a really good way to launch the segmentation, to get everyone in the company interested in it, and to convey the key points of it. The second example is very different, and I wouldn't suggest this type of launch for a government department necessarily. So it's a very, very different example. Here, the segmentation was required to help DWP roll out their communications plan for auto-enrolled pensions, which and this was done about 2 years ago. And obviously it's very topical. It's been on the ICG website as a subject people have been talking about because it's now starting. This particular segmentation had quite a few challenges. Pensions are a very boring subject for many people. You know, it's not something you talk to your friends about in the same way as you might, you know, football or clothes or something else. Many people are not saving enough for their retirement, but they don't want to admit to that. So you have issues about people telling you the truth, and how do you keep them engaged? So a boring subject, you know, and people don't really want to tell you what their real feelings are and what they're actually doing. So the solution to this was to not have a questionnaire about pensions, but to have a questionnaire about life, particularly about later life, and you know, what people were thinking of doing as their lives developed. So it was much more general. Some of the questions were asked in the third person rather than being a bit challenging. And pensions were then introduced quite a long way down the questionnaire as just one element of preparing for later life. And that work that was tested out in some qualitative work, and it seemed to be the best way of collecting good data about a difficult subject. There was a qualitative stage which generated a qualitative segmentation, and I suspect many of you involved today are qualitative researchers. Qualitative segmentations can be done, but my view would be that they're best done at a fairly generic level. At this sort of level, where there are 4 segments, then it works well. I have seen qualitative segmentations where someone's done 6 focus groups, yeah, and generated 12 segments, and yeah, and then when you try and replicate that in a quantitative stage, you have great difficulty finding some of the smaller, more esoteric segments, and you start wondering, were they just 2 people in the groups who had sort of idiosyncratic views about something, or were they really segments? So qualitative segments can be useful to give you a framework, as here, but yeah, they have limitations. So that was what came out of the qualitative work. When we did the quantitative work, we were able to put 10 clusters in this case into those 4 quadrants. So I'm going to show you the 10 segments here, and this was quite interesting in terms of the names of the segments. At this stage, the DWP didn't really know how it was going to use these segments in detail in terms of its marketing. It didn't want to get hung up on names that then might not be consistent with what it was going to do. And so we came up with this, what seemed initially to be a crazy idea of giving the segment names as song titles. So all of these segments are song titles, and you know, you may recognise some of them. And the names broadly came from the record collection of one of my colleagues who bought a lot of records in the 80s. The segments all have a decent size again here. They sort of run from 2 million to 6 million people when they're grossed up. So again, they meet that criteria. So the song titles, say, were a bit unusual, but it meant when we introduced the segments, hopefully this is going to work. Don't think it is. No, I can't hear the music on this one. But there should be a soundtrack on this. Don't worry, be happy. It definitely comes up on the next one. So the other advantage of this, using song titles, is when we presented 10 segments, and you spend 10 minutes on each one, so it's quite a long while. So don't you people get really bored? When you get to the 10th one, you actually got a bit of music to introduce the segment, and people will liven up again. And in fact, about 6 months later, I was at a launch of this segmentation, and someone came up to me and said, I really remember your presentation of the research. It was when you were singing and dancing, and I wasn't aware that we'd been dancing, but certainly the having the songs enable people to keep their interest. So don't worry, be happy. This is a group in the Quadrant where they have no plans, but they're quite confident. They're young. I'm not going to run through all this. It's a sort of verbal description of the segment. But basically, they're people who are yeah, it'll all be fine. It'll all come out fine. I'm not going to do much about it now. they didn't have pension provision in any sort of form, didn't have savings or ISAs, they're young, they're probably paying off student loans. They had lots of excuses as to why they were not putting money into pensions, and it wasn't that likely they were going to change what they did in the next 5 years. So quite a challenging segment for DWP to look at. They tried to avoid thinking about retirement, and they disagreed with lots of the things that were quite important if you wanted someone to make pension provision. This one's not playing either. This is a shame, but I don't know whether you can hear this, but I certainly can't. Okay, so brass in pocket. This is a group that are in the area where they're confident, but this time they do have some plans for their later life. Okay, again a sort of description, and we'll move quickly on to look at their some of their numeric data. This is completely the opposite to the don't worry, be happy segment. They have got some provision. They are saving for other things and so on, so they are making provision. And we look at their attitudes. They're confident, but they're rightly confident this time. They sorted things out themselves, and so on. When we looked at these 10 segments and sort of ranked them in terms of their need, if you like, to have communication to help them change their behaviour, we found that the first 3 segments covered about half of the target consumers for auto-enrolment, and the 5 segments covered 2/3. So if communication plans were developed just for those 3 segments, then it would reach half the target market. And this is quite an interesting thing with segmentations generally, if they're based on attitudes, both this example and the previous one. There's a group, there are some segments who are already doing what you want them to do, the passionates for eBay, and the brass in pockets for pensions. There are other groups, the uninterested, the bewildered for eBay, and some of the ones at the bottom here for pensions, where it's going to be very difficult to change their behaviour in the short term. But often there are some segments who are sort of in the middle, who are not quite doing what you want, but perhaps aren't so far away from it, and they're the ones perhaps where an organisation can devote most of its energies. And by understanding the needs and motivations of those 3 segments there for DWP, it means they can have 3 different approaches in terms of communications to encouraging those groups to get involved with auto-enrolment. Okay, in terms of implementation, we didn't take DWP down to a pub and have 7 cocktails, because that would probably be regarded as corruption. But we did focus on these groups, and we did sit on a steering group after the segmentation was developed for about a year to help the department ensure that it was used to the greatest of its potential. One of the things that was done here, and I mentioned these bridge surveys earlier on, if you want to map attitudinal segments onto a database of some sort, usually can't do it directly, because usually most customer databases don't have someone's views in terms of attitudinal statements. But you can run a bridge survey, and this was done here using TGI. I don't know if everyone's familiar with TGI, but it's run each year. It's a massive national survey covering virtually every subject under the sun. And what was done here was about 1,000 TGI respondents were re-interviewed and asked the DWP magic questions. This meant they could be put into their pension segments, and so there were about 1,000 people for whom we knew which pension segment they were in, and we knew the answers to all TGI questions. And so BMRB then ran another magic question algorithm which determines which TGI questions best predict which pension segment someone's in, and then apply that algorithm to everyone on the TGI database. So you can allocate everyone on that database then to one of your segments, and then use all the products that are in TGI for media planning, media choice, and so on. Now, if you were doing this for a client, if a client was keen to map segments onto their customer database, you could do the same thing. You could interview, some of their customers, ask them the magic questions, and then use all the variables that are on the customer database to derive another set of magic questions, and then use those to allocate everyone on the database to a segment. You won't get as high a degree of allocation accuracy as you would normally, but it can still be a very effective way of using attitudinal segments, but also being able to map them onto a customer database. So that's the way to deal with that if you want the richness of attitudinal segments. Okay, so we're pretty much on time. 2 summary charts. My experience is that segmentation can be a very powerful driver of business for a client. For eBay, it helped them reach their objective of 15 million customers. It helped the marketing director keep his job and hopefully earn himself a nice bonus. Other segmentations I've done, a classic we did was for Electronic Arts, which was presented as a BMRA innovations paper. Electronic Arts used segmentation to identify new segments, devise products for those segments, and it helped them increase their UK market share from 9% to 13% over a 3-year period, which was worth hundreds of millions of pounds to them. One of those projects where you wish you'd pitched it as, we'll take 10% of the extra revenue you get rather than a fixed fee. But there you go, that's life. That's why we're still working. So it can be a very powerful driver of business for a client. These are important lessons that I think I've learned over time, which I'd commend to you in any segmentation project you get involved in. It's important to have a clear statement of the business objectives and how the segmentation is going to help to achieve those. I've had clients come to me and say, we want to do a segmentation. You say, well, why? Say, well, everyone's doing segmentations. We haven't done one for 10 years. We think it's an important thing to do. You need to get beneath that and see why they want it, what they're going to use it for, because that will help you devise the right sort of project. A good understanding, you need a good understanding of the factors affecting consumer attitudes and behaviour in a market before you start, either from information the client's already got or from a qualitative stage, so that you can make sure you measure the right things in the market to get the best segmentations. You need a good analyst to undertake the cluster analysis. It's important, it's necessary that you have a good technical segmentation, but as I hope I've communicated today, it's not sufficient. You need other things to make sure that segmentation works really well for your client, and an internal champion can help do that. Someone who will take the segmentation on, become as enthusiastic about it after it's been done as you've been while it's been done. Think carefully about segment names. They can be powerful in helping the clients understand the segment, but if you put too much in them, they can be hostages to fortune. So if you give them any sort of demographic tendency in the name, that can make people think everyone in that segment is a male or female or young and old, when in reality it might just be there's a skew in that segment towards females or towards older people. And do determine up front if you need to map segments onto a customer list. If it's critical, you might just want to use internal data, but you then you lose the richness that an attitudinal segmentation can give you. So think about the bridge survey, because it's usually quite an effective way of putting attitudes onto a customer database.